Welcome. If these quiet evenings speak to you, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories are always waiting, about the past and the future, about people, myths, and the spaces in between. Let them become part of your nightly ritual, a familiar voice in the dark. Tonight's story is about knights, but not the shining figures from songs and tapestries. This is a story about real people of the Middle Ages, living in a world where honor and cruelty often walked side by side, and where nobility was born less from ideals than from necessity. Close your eyes. The story begins. They told the story of knights as if it were a prayer, polished armor gleaming in the sun, vows sworn before God and king, swords drawn only in defense of the weak. It was a story sung by minstrels in warm halls and copied by monks whose hands had never blistered from a shield strap. It was not the story that men like Sir Aldric lived. Aldric awoke before dawn in the outer bailey of Lord Renaud's castle, not to the sound of trumpets or hymns, but to shouting. Someone was beating a servant for sleeping through his watch, and the crack of leather on flesh carried easily through the cold morning air. Aldric rolled from his straw pallet, his joints stiff, his mouth sour with last night's wine. His mail shirt lay in a heap beside him, still stained with old rust and darker spots that no scrubbing ever fully removed. He dressed without ceremony. There was no squire to lace his gambeson this morning. The boy had been sent to fetch rents from a nearby village and hadn't yet returned. Aldric tied the cords himself, muttering curses under his breath. A knight's life, as the poets described it, was one of honor and service. In truth, it was mostly discomfort, hunger, and waiting for orders, for pay, for war, or for some opportunity to improve one's standing by any means available. Outside, the courtyard was already alive. Horses stamped in their tethers, steam rising from their flanks. Men-at-arms sharpened spearheads or argued over dice games abandoned at sunrise. The smell of dung, wet earth, and cheap ale hung over everything. This was the reality of chivalry. Mud on boots, lice in hair, and the constant awareness that one wrong word could earn a beating or worse. Lord Renaud himself emerged from the keep shortly after dawn, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak. He was not yet 40, but his face was already heavy, his eyes sharp with calculation. He had earned his lands not through some noble quest, but through a fortunate marriage and a timely betrayal during a border dispute. Aldric knew the story well. Everyone did, though few spoke of it openly. "Mount up," Renaud called. "We ride south." No explanation followed, and none was expected. Knights did not always know why they rode, only that riding meant plunder or blood, sometimes both. Aldric felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation. War, at least, brought clarity. You knew who your enemy was, and you knew what you stood to gain. They rode within the hour, a small force of mounted knights and twice as many foot soldiers. The road south wound through fields that had once been green, but now lay trampled and bare. Peasants watched from a distance, faces blank, hands clenched around tools that could never truly defend them. Aldric met their gazes without expression. He had learned long ago that pity was a luxury. Today these villagers might offer bread and salt. Tomorrow they might shelter an enemy or refuse to pay their dues. Either way, the sword would decide. By midday, the purpose of the ride became clear. They reached a manor held by a minor lord who had recently declared loyalty to a rival count. The banners still flew above the wooden palisade, bright against the sky, as if defiance alone could protect them. Renaud did not bother with parley. The order to attack came swiftly, and Aldrich spurred his horse forward with the others. The clash was brief and brutal. There were no heroic duels, no measured exchanges of blows. This was violence at close quarters, men screaming, shields splintering, horses collapsing under pikes. Aldrich struck down a man who could not have been more than 17, his sword biting into flesh through poorly fitted mail. The boy's eyes were wide with shock as he fell, and Aldrich did not look back. When it was over, the manor burned. Smoke rose into the afternoon sky, carrying with it the cries of women and the crackle of collapsing beams. Renaud's men dragged out chests, livestock, anything of value. This too was chivalry, the right of conquest, sanctified by custom and necessity. That night, they camped among the ruins. Wine flowed freely, and laughter followed. Someone found a lute and played a bawdy tune. Aldrich sat apart, cleaning his blade. He felt no triumph, only a dull weariness. He had fought in a dozen such raids, each one justified by some claim or counterclaim that mattered only to men with seals and titles. A younger knight, Sir Mathieu, joined him, his face flushed with drink. "Did you see me today?" Mathieu asked, grinning. "I took 3 of them myself." Aldrich nodded. "I saw. They'll sing of it one day," Mathieu continued. "Bravery like that doesn't go unnoticed." Aldrich almost laughed. "If they sing," he said, "they'll forget the screaming." Mathieu frowned, uncomprehending, and staggered back toward the fire. He still believed the songs. In the weeks that followed, Aldrich saw more of the same. They rode from village to village, enforcing Renaud's claims, extracting taxes at sore point, punishing imagined slights. Once, they hanged a miller accused of hiding grain. The man protested his innocence until the rope tightened. Afterward, Renaud declared the matter settled. Between raids, there were intrigues. Messengers arrived at night, cloaked and cautious. Renaud held whispered meetings with other lords, trading promises like coin. Aldrich was sometimes summoned as a witness or escort, his presence a reminder of force behind polite words. He learned that loyalty was flexible, honor negotiable. Alliances shifted with the season, and yesterday's enemy could be tomorrow's ally if the price was right. The church preached virtue and restraint, but even the priests knew when to avert their eyes. Blessings were given before battle, absolution promised after. Sin, like land, could be managed. Aldrich himself was no innocent. He had taken what he wanted when he could, from gold to women to moments of petty power. He told himself he did what he must to survive, to secure a future in a world that offered little mercy. Yet sometimes, in the quiet before sleep, he wondered whether there had ever been another path. One winter evening, as snow fell thick and silent, a troubadour arrived at the castle. He sang of noble knights and fair ladies, of justice triumphant and evil undone. The hall listened raptly, warmed by fire and illusion. Aldrich watched the faces around him soften, even Renaud's, and understood the song's true purpose. It was not to tell the truth, but to soothe it away. When the troubadour finished, applause filled the hall. Coins were tossed at his feet. He bowed deeply, smiling. Aldrich did not clap. He stared into the flames and saw not glory, but smoke rising from burning homes, and the eyes of a dying boy on a blood-soaked field. The myth of the noble knight was powerful because it was needed to justify the sword, to quiet the conscience, to turn brutality into virtue. Outside, The snow continued to fall, covering tracks and stains alike. Tomorrow, there would be new orders, new enemies, new reasons to ride, and the songs would follow, reshaping what happened into something easier to bear. Winter tightened its grip on the land, and with it came hunger, not only for bread, but for opportunity. Snow sealed the roads, slowing merchants and messengers alike. Yet intrigue did not freeze. It merely moved indoors, closer to hearth fires and whispered councils. Aldrich was summoned one night to the solar above the great hall. The stairs creaked beneath his boots, and he noted, as always, how poorly the castle had been built, more for display than defense. Inside, Lord Renaud stood with two other men. Sir Etienne, a knight whose polished manners concealed a vicious temper, and Father Lucien, the castle's chaplain, thin as a fasting saint and twice as sharp. "The Count of Valmont moves against us," Renaud said without preamble. "He gathers men under the pretense of defending pilgrims. A holy cause, apparently." Father Lucien smiled faintly. "God's causes are many, my lord. Some merely wear his name." Renaud turned to Aldrich. "You will ride to Valmont's lands, quietly. There is a village near the river Sancerre. They supply his garrison. Burn it." Aldrich felt a familiar heaviness settle in his gut. In winter, Renaud confirmed. "Let hunger do the rest." No one spoke of honor. No one needed to. Aldrich bowed and withdrew, the decision already made without him. That, too, was the life of a knight, not choosing the deed, only carrying it out. They rode before dawn with a small band, cloaks pulled tight against the cold. The countryside lay hushed under snow, every sound amplified. Aldrich's horse snorted, uneasy, as if sensing what lay ahead. By midday, they saw the thin smoke of Sancerre rising into the pale sky. The village was small, no palisade, only a cluster of wooden houses and a stone chapel. Aldrich watched the people scatter as they approached, panic spreading faster than any shouted warning. Some ran for the woods, others knelt in the snow, hands raised. Sir Etienne laughed. "They know us," he said. "Good." The attack was swift. Torches were thrown, roofs caught, and the air filled with screams and the smell of burning thatch. Aldrich dismounted and moved through the chaos with grim efficiency. He kicked in doors, overturned chests, seized what little food they had stored for the winter. A woman clung to his arm, begging in a cracked voice. He shook her off and moved on. Near the chapel, he found a man standing his ground, a grey-bearded villager holding a woodcutter's axe. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Aldrich saw not defiance, but despair. "Go," Aldrich said quietly. "Take whoever you can and run." The man hesitated, then dropped the axe and fled. Aldrich turned away before anyone could notice. When it was over, Sancerre smouldered, its people scattered or dead. The knights rode away laden with supplies, leaving ruin behind. That night, as they camped by the river, Etienne boasted of the lesson they had taught. Aldrich said nothing. The firelight flickered over his hands, and he scrubbed them raw in the icy water, as if he could wash away the memory. News traveled quickly, even in winter. Valmont retaliated within weeks, raiding villages under Renaud's protection. The borderlands descended into a cycle of reprisal that none of the lords truly wished to stop. War, after all, was profitable. Ransoms were collected, lands seized, debts erased by death. Spring came early, the snow melting into mud. With it came open battle. Renaud joined forces with two neighbouring lords, their banners fluttering side by side despite old grievances. Aldrich recognised the pattern. Enemies united by convenience, not loyalty. They met Valmont's army on a broad plain near the river. The ground was soft, treacherous. Priests moved among the ranks, offering blessings and absolution. Aldrich knelt, as was expected, and murmured the prayers. He wondered, not for the first time, whether God listened, or whether he had long since turned his face away. The battle began with the thunder of hooves. Knights charged, lances leveled, the impact shattering men and horses alike. Aldrich felt the jolt run through his arm as his lance struck home, throwing his opponent backward. He drew his sword as he rode on, the world narrowing to motion and noise. There was no room for ideals here. Men fought to survive, to protect their companions, to earn favor or loot. Aldrich cut down a knight bearing Valmont's colors, then another who tried to flank him. He slipped in the mud, narrowly avoiding a blade that whistled past his head. A foot soldier lunged, and Aldrich struck him down without slowing. By midday, the field was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay tangled, banners trampled, the river running red in places. Valmont's forces broke and fled, and Renault's men pursued them mercilessly. Aldrich reined in his horse, watching the rout. Victory, such as it was, tasted of ash. After the battle, the work continued. Prisoners were taken, those wealthy enough to ransom. The rest were dispatched or pressed into service. Aldrich helped strip the dead of armor and weapons, the metal clinking dully. He recognized a face among the fallen. Sir Mathieu, the young knight who had once dreamed of songs. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky. They buried Mathieu hastily, without ceremony. There was no time for grief. In the weeks that followed, Renault's power grew. He was praised as a defender of the realm, his actions reframed as necessary and just. A messenger from the capital brought congratulations and a token gift from the king, a gilded spur, a symbol of favor. Renault displayed it proudly. Aldrich received nothing beyond his share of loot. He did not expect more. One evening, he encountered Father Lucien alone in the chapel. The priest was lighting candles, their small flames trembling. "Do you believe the songs?" Aldrich asked abruptly. Lucien looked up, unsurprised. "Believe them. The tales of noble knights, of honor." Lucien smiled sadly. "Belief is a tool, Sir Aldrich, like your sword. It serves a purpose. And the truth is dangerous," Lucien replied. "It breeds doubt. Doubt breeds disobedience." Aldrich nodded. "So we lie." "We shape," Lucien corrected gently. "Reality is too sharp for most men. It cuts them." Aldrich left the chapel with a bitter taste in his mouth. As summer approached, a new opportunity arose, one more personal. Renault offered Aldrich a small fief, seized from a defeated rival. It was not much, 3 villages, poor soil, but it was land, and with it, a measure of independence. "You have served well," Renault said. "This is your reward." Aldrich accepted. What choice did he have? To refuse would be an insult, perhaps a threat. Yet the gift weighed on him. He knew what it meant to be lord of villages, taxes to collect, punishments to enforce, loyalty to extract. When he visited his new lands, he saw the fear in the peasants' eyes as they knelt before him. He saw himself reflected there, not as a hero, but as another master with a sword. One night, alone in the small manor house that now belonged to him, Aldrich dreamed of fire and snow, of songs turning into screams. He woke sweating, the weight of his mail pressing into his chest, though he had not worn it to bed. The myth of the noble knight promised clarity, good and evil neatly divided. Reality was murkier. Knights were men, bound by ambition, fear, and the brutal logic of their age. They fought not because they were virtuous, but because fighting was the surest path to survival and power. Aldrich rose before dawn and stepped outside. The land was quiet, the air cool. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. Life went on, indifferent to ideals. He knew he would ride again. There would be more wars, more intrigues, more justifications wrapped in fine words. And there would be songs, always songs, polishing the blade of history until it shone. But Aldrich would remember the truth, even if no one else wished to hear it. The years that followed did not soften Aldrich. They sharpened him like a blade honed so often that little metal remained to be spared. His small fief demanded attention, and he learned quickly that ruling was simply war slowed to a crawl. Where battles were decided by steel, lordship was decided by hunger, fear, and example. The first rebellion came in autumn. It was not grand, no banners, no speeches. A few villages delayed their taxes, claiming failed harvests. Aldrich knew the lie at once. He had ridden those fields himself. The grain had grown thin, yes, but not thin enough to excuse defiance. He summoned the elders. They arrived trembling, caps in hand, speaking of children and winter. Once, Aldrich might have listened longer. Now he thought of Renaud, of Valmont, of Sancerre. He ordered one man flogged in the square. Not to death, just enough. The others watched. The taxes were paid within the week. That night, Aldrich drank alone. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he had been merciful. Both things were true, and both felt hollow. Word of his efficiency spread. Merchants felt safer on his road, safer than elsewhere at least, and paid for escorts. Lesser knights sought his favor, hoping for employment or marriage alliances. Aldrich played the game because refusing to play was itself dangerous. A lord without allies was prey. It was during one such negotiation that Lady Isabel entered his life. She was the widow of a knight who had fallen in Valmont's rout, her lands reduced and contested. She came not with tears, but with documents, claims, charters, seals. She spoke plainly, without deference, and Aldrich found himself listening in a way he rarely did. "You need my lands," she said calmly. "They border the river. Without them, your fief is vulnerable." "And you need protection," Aldrich replied. "I need stability," Isabel corrected. "Protection is only a means." They married in spring, with modest ceremony. The church approved. The neighbors took note. Isabel proved shrewd, overseeing stores, negotiating rents, tempering Aldrich's harsher instincts when it suited her. She did not preach morality. She spoke of outcomes. "Fear lasts," she once said, "but resentment lasts longer. Decide which you can afford." Together, they strengthened the fief. Aldrich began to believe briefly that he had found a different path. That power, wielded carefully, might be something other than pure brutality. Then the king died. The news arrived with black seals and hurried riders. Succession was uncertain. Factions formed overnight. Old claims were dusted off. Alliances reweighed. Renaud sent a message within days, summoning Aldrich and his men. "You owe me," the letter said simply. Aldrich read it twice. He did owe Renaud his knighthood, his land, his survival. But he also knew what this meant. Civil war, painted as justice. Isabel watched him silently as he folded the letter. "If you ride," she said at last, "you risk everything we've built." "If I don't," Aldrich replied, "I lose it anyway." They rode within the fortnight. The war that followed was worse than any border feud. Knights fought knights, men who had shared tables now sharing blades. Villagers were caught between shifting loyalties, punished no matter whom they supported. Aldrich saw banners change overnight, oaths broken with practiced ease. Renaud fought fiercely, but recklessly. He sought glory now, not merely advantage. Aldrich recognized the hunger in him, the same hunger that had driven younger men like Mathieu to their deaths. The decisive battle came near the capital. The field was crowded, the air thick with dust and prayer. Aldrich rode at Renaud's side, cutting down opponents whose armor bore familiar colors. In the chaos, Renaud overextended. An enemy knight struck him from the side, the lance piercing beneath the arm. Renaud fell, trampled before anyone could reach him. For a moment, the world slowed. Aldrich could have retrieved the body, rallied the men, continued the fight. Instead, he hesitated, and in that hesitation, the line broke. Renaud's forces scattered. Aldrich barely escaped, wounded and furious, carrying the weight of a choice he could not fully name. Renaud's death reshaped everything. His lands were divided, his name condemned as a traitor by the victorious faction. Aldrich returned home to find messengers waiting royal envoys questioning his loyalties, neighbors probing his defenses. Isabel met him at the gate. She said nothing of Renaud. "We must decide," she said, "who we are now." The answer came sooner than expected. An edict arrived, declaring Aldrich's fief forfeit. His association with Renaud deemed sufficient cause. Another lord was granted the land. Aldrich was ordered to surrender peacefully. He laughed when he read it. A short, bitter sound. Peaceful surrender meant hanging, or worse. That night, Aldrich armed his men. Not many answered the call. Loyalty, he had learned, was always conditional. They did not make a stand. They fled. For months, Aldrich lived as an outlaw knight, leading a band of dispossessed soldiers through forests and ruined roads. They raided convoys, extorted villages, sold their swords to whoever paid. The line between knight and brigand vanished entirely. Minstrels would later call such men free companies, romanticizing their lawlessness. Aldrich knew the truth. They were wolves, created by war, unable to return to any other life. Isabel traveled with them longer than he expected. She negotiated ransoms, arranged safe passages, kept them alive. But even she could not endure forever. One night, after a failed raid left 3 men dead, she told Aldrich she was leaving. "There is no future here," she said, "only motion." Aldrich did not argue. He watched her ride away at dawn, a solitary figure fading into the mist. Years passed. Aldrich grew older, harder. His hair grayed beneath his helm. His name became known, then feared. Lords hired him when convenient, disavowed him when not. The church condemned him in sermons while accepting his donations in private. One winter, wounded and weary, Aldrich took shelter in a monastery. The monks tended him reluctantly. On the walls of the scriptorium, he saw illuminated manuscripts, knights radiant with virtue, swords raised for justice. A young monk noticed his gaze. "You are a knight?" he asked, awe in his voice. "I was," Aldrich replied. "What was it like?" the monk pressed. "Was it honorable?" Aldrich considered the question for a long time. "It was necessary," he said at last, "and it was cruel. Anything beyond that is a story we tell ourselves." The monk frowned, disappointed. When Aldrich left the monastery, he knew his time was ending. He had outlived most of the men he once rode with. The world was changing, slowly, unevenly, but changing nonetheless. He died not in battle, but on a muddy road, struck down by fever. There were no songs, no banners. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. Yet somewhere, a minstrel sang of noble knights, of honor and justice, of swords that defended the innocent. And somewhere else, peasants rebuilt burned homes, widows counted losses, and new boys strapped on armor, believing the myth. The truth remained, unspoken but enduring. Knights were not born of virtue, but of violence, not sustained by honor, but by power. And the world they shaped bore the marks of their hands, scarred, bloodstained, and all too human. Death did not end Aldrich's story, so much as it dissolved it into others. The muddy road where he fell lay a day's ride from a market town. A charcoal burner found the body at dawn, recognized the mail and sword, and said a prayer before looting the boots. By nightfall, the fever had taken its due, and the world moved on with the same indifference it always had. There were no witnesses to argue over the meaning of his life, no chronicler to set ink to parchment. Yet meaning has a way of attaching itself to absence. In the market town, a rumor spread of a dead knight, a feared captain brought low by sickness. Some said he had been cursed by God for his crimes. Others said he had been betrayed by his own men. Within a week, the story had grown a spine. The knight had refused to kneel to injustice. He had died defiant, unbroken. By the end of the month, a song had begun to circulate, an unnamed knight, wronged by kings, loyal unto death. The song was good. That was the trouble. A boy named Thomas heard it for the first time in the courtyard of an inn. He was 12, thin as a reed, with a shock of hair that refused to lie flat. His mother scrubbed floors for the innkeeper. His father had died in a levee years before, crushed under a horse at a battle whose name no one remembered. Thomas listened as the minstrel's voice rose and fell, carrying steel and sorrow in equal measure. When the song ended, Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Not grief. He barely knew his father, but purpose. The knight in the song had chosen his path. He had mattered. That night, Thomas practiced with a stick behind the stables, slashing at shadows until his arms ached. He did not know Aldrich's name. He did not need to. The myth had done its work. Years later, Thomas would serve as a squire in a lord's household, not far from the river Aldrich once guarded. The lord was young and eager, keen on reviving old virtues. He hosted tournaments, encouraged courtesy, sponsored clerics who preached restraint. He spoke often of reform, of a cleaner kind of knighthood. Behind closed doors, he bargained as ruthlessly as any man before him. Thomas learned quickly. He learned how to polish armor until it gleamed, and how to look away when prisoners were questioned too harshly. He learned the difference between mercy shown and mercy proclaimed. He learned that the same hand that signed arms could sign execution orders without pause. One evening, while carrying wine into the solar, Thomas overheard a conversation that made him pause. Bandits on the North Road, the Lord was saying. Former soldiers, likely. They've taken a village. His advisor, a man with ink-stained fingers, shrugged. Hang a few. The rest will scatter. And the village? Burn it. Set an example. Thomas felt the words like a blow. Burn it. He had heard that phrase before, in other mouths, in other years. He wondered, suddenly, who had burned whose village first. The raid went ahead at dawn. Thomas rode behind his lord, watching smoke curl into the sky as they approached. He saw the villagers kneel, saw the confusion when soldiers struck regardless. He saw a woman clutching a child and a man standing with an axe, hopeless and brave. Thomas wanted to believe this was an aberration, a mistake that would be corrected. Instead, it was rewarded. The Lord was praised for restoring order. The church blessed the effort. The road was declared safe again. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He remembered the song, "The Knight Who Had Refused to Kneel." He wondered where such men truly came from, or whether they existed only in verses. Elsewhere, in a scriptorium far from the river, a monk named Bernard copied an old chronicle. He worked by lamplight, his fingers cramped, his eyes tired. The chronicle described a series of wars decades past, full of names Bernard barely recognized. One passage mentioned a mercenary captain who had troubled the countryside before dying of illness. Bernard paused. The marginal note beside the passage, written in a different hand, caught his attention. A violent man, yet some called him just. Bernard frowned. He had been taught to see history as instruction, a guide to virtue. Yet here was ambiguity, scratched into the margin like a doubt that refused erasure. On impulse, Bernard added his own note. Truth is often divided among those who suffer it. He hesitated, then blotted the ink. Such thoughts were not encouraged. In the capital, nobles debated reforms. The King's Council spoke of limiting private wars, of enforcing law over force. Charters were drafted, seals pressed. Each clause was negotiated, weakened, compromised. Knights would still be needed, they argued, to enforce the law, to protect the realm. Swords remained useful. The church, too, adjusted its language. Sermons emphasized restraint, but upheld obedience. Knights were urged to see themselves as instruments of divine order. Confession became a salve, a way to cleanse acts that could not be undone. In villages, people adapted as they always had. They learned which banners to welcome and which to fear. They hid grain, married daughters strategically, prayed for mild winters. They told stories to children, warnings disguised as fairy tales. Knights appeared in these stories not as heroes, but as storms, powerful, unpredictable, sometimes survivable if one was clever. Time moved forward, grinding myths and men alike. Decades after Aldrich's death, an old woman sat by a hearth and told her grandson about a knight who once passed through her village. She did not know his name. She remembered only his eyes, tired, watchful, and how he had turned away when others burned. "He wasn't good," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "But he wasn't cruel that day." The boy listened, absorbing this quieter story. It did not thrill him the way songs did. It lingered instead, like a question. The myth of the noble knight never truly died because it was useful. It gave meaning to violence, shape to chaos. It allowed men to believe they were more than tools, and allowed those who suffered to hope that somewhere justice existed. But beneath the myth ran another current, harder to sing. Knights were bound not by virtue, but by structures, land, obligation, fear, reward. Their choices mattered, but those choices were made within a cage forged long before they were born. Aldrich had lived and died within that cage. He had pushed against its bars at times, rattled them, even widened a gap or two. He had never escaped. Neither would Thomas. Neither would the young lord, or the monk, or the countless others drawn into the orbit of sword and seal. Some would try to be better. Some would fail. Most would do what was required and call it something else. History would remember the banners and the victories, the laws passed and the wars won. It would remember knights as symbols of honor or oppression, depending on the teller. What it would not easily remember were the in-between moments, the hesitation before a strike, the mercy granted unnoticed, the cruelty justified and regretted in the same breath. Those moments lived only in memory, fragile and fading, and yet they were the truest measure of the age. The Middle Ages were not shaped by noble ideals alone, nor by brutality unchecked, but by the constant tension between what men claimed to be and what they were forced or chose to do. Knights stood at the center of that tension, armored embodiments of contradiction. They were not monsters, they were not heroes, they were men with swords, living in a world that rewarded violence and wrapped it in meaning. The myth of their nobility endured because it needed to, because without it, the past would be too honest and the present too uncomfortable. So the songs continued, and so did the silence beneath them. Silence, however, has a way of changing shape. Long after Aldrich's name had dissolved into rumor and metaphor, his sword remained. It passed from hand to hand, stripped of its story, gaining new ones like scars. Steel outlives intention. It was found in a pawn shop in the capital by a man named Hugo de Marcenay, a minor noble with major ambitions. The blade was plain, well balanced, its hilt worn smooth by years of use. No jewels, no inscriptions. Hugo liked that. He purchased it cheaply, sensing something indefinable in its weight. Hugo was not cruel by temperament. That distinction mattered to him. He considered himself pragmatic. He believed cruelty was inefficient, that terror created instability. Order, he believed, required force applied with calculation. In this, he differed little from hundreds of knights before him, though he would have denied the comparison. When unrest flared in the western marches, peasants refusing corvée labor, rumors of heretical preachers Hugo volunteered to restore peace. He rode at the head of 50 men, banners clean, armor polished. Chroniclers would later describe him as disciplined, restrained. The villagers described him differently. Hugo listened to complaints. He held councils. He punished a handful of offenders, publicly stocks, whippings, a single hanging. He burned no villages. He prided himself on that. Yet he doubled labor demands and seized grain temporarily, promising compensation that never came. The revolt collapsed within weeks. Hugo was praised at court. His methods were held up as proof that knighthood could be reformed. The sword at his side was used sparingly. When it was, it cut clean. One night, after the campaign ended, Hugo dined with a royal clerk who recorded the events. The clerk asked, almost casually, "Do you believe you acted justly?" Hugo smiled. "Justice is peace," he said, and peace was achieved. The clerk nodded and wrote that down. In a village near the marches, an old man told his granddaughter about the year the knights came and took their grain. He did not mention Hugo's name. He mentioned the winter that followed. Justice, like honor, depended on where one stood. The decades wore on. Armor styles changed. Castles grew more ornate, then more obsolete. Crossbows, then firearms, altered the nature of battle. Knights adapted or faded, some becoming officers, others ceremonial relics clinging to relevance. But the myth adapted faster than the men. New songs spoke of knights as guardians of law, protectors of order against chaos. The language shifted, but the function remained the same. Violence, reframed, remained acceptable. In a monastery school, students debated a text that argued whether a knight's obedience absolved him of guilt. The master cited Augustine. A student asked whether ignorance excused harm. The master frowned. "These are dangerous questions," he said. "They weaken authority." "But authority can be wrong," the student insisted. "Authority," the master replied, is what keeps the world from tearing itself apart. The discussion ended there. That student, years later, would serve as a legal advisor to a duke. He would draft edicts regulating knightly conduct codes of behavior, punishments for excess. He would believe sincerely that he was improving the world. The duke would ignore the edicts when convenient. Elsewhere, Thomas, no longer a squire, now a knight himself, stood before a mirror, adjusting his belt. He bore scars now, none of them heroic. He had fought in skirmishes, suppressed unrest, escorted tax collectors. He had also, on occasion, intervened, stopped a beating, released a prisoner, diverted a patrol. Each act of mercy felt small. Each act of obedience felt heavy. One evening, after returning from a punitive expedition, Thomas found himself unable to eat. He wandered into the town and listened to a minstrel performing in the square. The song was familiar, too familiar. The unnamed knight, betrayed, wandering, dying alone. Thomas realized with a jolt that he had grown up on this song, that it had led him here. Afterward, he approached the minstrel. "Where did that story come from?" he asked. The minstrel shrugged. "Old tale, passed down." Was he real? "All good stories are," the minstrel said lightly. "In parts." That night, Thomas dreamed of a road soaked in rain, of a man lying still while the world walked past. He woke before dawn and sat in silence, his sword across his knees. He did not leave knighthood. Few did. Leaving required alternatives, and alternatives were rare. But something in him shifted. He stopped believing the story without question. That skepticism did not make him virtuous. It made him cautious. Years later, during another internal war, Thomas faced a choice. His commander ordered the execution of prisoners accused of aiding rebels. The evidence was thin. The order was lawful. Thomas hesitated. He remembered the old woman's story. He had heard it once, in a village much like this one. A knight who had turned away. He disobeyed. The prisoners lived. Thomas was censured, fined, removed from favor. He did not regret it, though the cost was real. He never rose high. He survived. History did not record his name. That was often the price of deviation. As centuries turned, chroniclers refined their narratives. Knights became symbols of a bygone age, romanticized further as they lost real power. Pain dulled with distance. What remained were ideals, clean and shining. Modern readers would one day marvel at the contrast, the brutality of the age, the beauty of the stories. They would ask whether the knights were truly so cruel, or whether the cruelty was exaggerated. The answer lay, inconveniently, in between. Knights were capable of mercy and of atrocity. They lived in systems that rewarded the latter and praised the former when it was safe. They navigated expectations that pulled them toward violence while asking them to appear virtuous. They were not uniformly corrupt nor tragically noble. They were participants. Aldrich's life, unremarkable in its time, was remarkable only in hindsight because it revealed the machinery behind the myth. His choices were constrained, his compromises familiar, his end uncelebrated, yet his shadow lingered in songs, in doubts, in the small acts of resistance that never made it into verse. The myth of the noble knight survived because people needed it to survive the truth. But the truth survived too, carried quietly in memory, in marginal notes, in stories told by hearths rather than halls. And that truth was this: honor was not a defining trait of knighthood, but a fragile, personal struggle within it. The sword did not make a man noble. At best, it revealed what was already there, and too often, it revealed nothing worth praising. The Middle Ages were not an age of noble knights betrayed by reality. They were an age of reality betrayed by noble stories. And in that betrayal, generations learned how easily violence could be dressed as virtue, and how hard it was to undress it once the song had begun. When the songs finally began to lose their power, it was not because they were challenged directly, but because the world they described no longer fit the world people inhabited. The change was slow, uneven, and resisted at every turn. Cities grew, trade routes thickened, coin began to rival land as a source of power. Lords still demanded service, but increasingly they demanded taxes rather than men. War did not disappear, it professionalized. Companies of soldiers were hired for wages, dismissed when inconvenient, blamed when excess could no longer be ignored. Knights found themselves displaced, then repurposed. Some adapted. They became officers, administrators, courtiers, men whose swords were symbols more than tools. Others clung to the old ways, insisting that steel still defined worth. Those men often died young or bitter, casualties of an age that had outgrown them. Yet the myth persisted, even as the material conditions that had birthed it eroded. Painters filled churches with armored saints. Poets wrote epics about chivalric virtue long after chivalry had ceased to govern conduct. The distance between representation and reality widened, and in that widening, the lie became easier to maintain. It was during this period that a scholar named Mathieu Dahl began collecting testimonies. Mathieu was not a revolutionary. He was a careful man, trained in law and letters, loyal to the crown. His interest in knights was academic, born from frustration with contradictions in official records. Victories described as bloodless, rebellions reduced to footnotes, punishments omitted entirely. So he traveled. He spoke with veterans whose hands shook when they lifted cups, with widows who remembered banners more clearly than names, with priests who had heard confessions they were never meant to repeat. Mathieu wrote it all down, cautiously, anonymously, disguising truth as observation. One entry read, "The knight is praised for restraint when he does not kill where killing is permitted. Thus mercy is defined not by goodness, but by deviation from expected harm." Another, "They speak of honor as if it were armor, but it is closer to a wound, easily reopened, painful to carry, and visible only to the one who bears it." Mathieu never published his work. He knew better. Instead, his notes circulated privately, copied selectively, softened by cautious readers. Still, they seeded doubt. Doubt was dangerous. At court, reformers argued that the excesses of the past were aberrations. Bad knights, they said, not bad systems. They drafted new codes, swore new oaths, added layers of ceremony meant to civilize violence. The result was not peace, but decorum. Executions were formalized. Raids were renamed campaigns. Confiscations were legalized. The sword remained, but it was now accompanied by paperwork. Peasants noticed little difference. In one border town, a tax revolt broke out after years of failed harvests. The Lord sent men, not knights this time, but soldiers wearing his colors. They enforced order efficiently. No looting, no random killings, only arrests, seizures, deportations. The chronicler praised the operation as humane. The town did not recover. A child born there years later would grow up hearing stories of knights as heroes, long gone, protectors of the weak. He would never hear about the soldiers because they did not fit the story. Violence to be remembered, had to be meaningful. Knights provided meaning. Bureaucracy did not. That was the true legacy of knighthood. Not the acts themselves, but the framework they created for understanding power. The sword taught society how to excuse force. Even as knights faded, the logic they embodied endured. Authority justified harm. Obedience cleansed guilt. Responsibility flowed upward until it vanished. Centuries later, philosophers would argue over these ideas as abstractions, stripped of blood and smoke. They would debate duty, legitimacy, just war. Few would trace those debates back to men like Aldrich Mudstained, half forgotten, acting within constraints few acknowledged. And yet Aldrich's world never truly disappeared. It resurfaced whenever violence was needed, but virtue desired. Whenever men were asked to do harm for reasons they did not choose. Whenever systems rewarded compliance and punished conscience. The knight was not a relic, he was a prototype. This became clear during a famine that struck the northern regions generations later. Grain prices soared, riots followed. The crown dispatched forces to maintain order. Their commander addressed his men before deployment. "You are not here to punish," he said. "You are here to restore stability." The words could have been spoken by any lord centuries earlier. The soldiers followed orders. They cleared streets, guarded granaries, broke strikes. Some used restraint, some did not. All were shielded by necessity. Afterward, medals were awarded, reports were written, responsibility dissolved into structure. A clerk reviewing the records paused over a familiar phrasing. Unavoidable losses. He had read it before in older texts, describing burned villages and dead children. The language had survived even when the armor had not. History, he realized, was less a series of events than a series of permissions. Meanwhile, the songs evolved again. Now they were stories of individual virtue triumphing over corrupt systems. Lone knights standing against injustice, martyrs to conscience. These stories appealed especially to those who felt powerless. They reassured listeners that goodness could exist within cruelty, that one righteous man might redeem a violent order. They were comforting. They were also rare. Most men, like Aldrich, like Thomas, like Hugo, did not stand alone against the world. They navigated it, compromised with it, survived it. Their lives did not resolve cleanly into lessons. They were messy, contradictory, unfinished. That is why they were forgotten. The past favors clarity. It prefers heroes or villains, not participants. Yet occasionally, something disrupted the pattern. In a provincial archive, a young historian uncovered fragments of Mathieu Dahl's notes. The handwriting was faded, the margins damaged, but enough remained to unsettle her. She compared the notes to official chronicles, noting the absences. She wrote an article. It was cautious, heavily footnoted, framed as a reassessment rather than an accusation. It suggested that the traditional image of knighthood had obscured more than it revealed. The response was swift and defensive. Critics accused her of anachronism, of imposing modern values on the past. They were men of their time, they said. You cannot judge them by standards they did not know. She agreed. That was her point. They knew the standards, she replied. They just could not afford to follow them. The debate did not change public opinion. Myths rarely collapse under scrutiny. But it did something quieter. It made uncertainty respectable. Students began asking different questions. Not, were knights noble, but why did people need them to be? Not, did honor exist, but who benefited when it was invoked? Those questions did not dismantle the past, they complicated it. And in that complication, figures like Aldrich became visible, not as exceptions, not as villains, but as evidence. Evidence that the myth of the noble knight was not born of ignorance, but of necessity, that it functioned as a moral technology, smoothing over violence by personalizing it, that it allowed societies to outsource cruelty to individuals and then absolve themselves by praising ideals those individuals could rarely meet. The myth was not false because knights were always cruel. It was false because it implied that cruelty was a failure of character rather than a feature of the role. Aldrich had lived that truth without naming it. He had enforced power, benefited from it, suffered under it, and eventually been discarded by it. His moments of mercy had not redeemed the system, nor had his brutality defined him entirely. He had been, above all, typical, and that was the most uncomfortable conclusion of all. Not that knights were monsters, but that ordinary men, placed in violent structures and rewarded for obedience, would act much as they did then and now. The Middle Ages did not end because people became kinder. They ended because power reorganized itself, found new tools, new stories. The sword gave way to law, to bureaucracy, to distance. But the logic remained. Somewhere, a child still heard a story about a noble warrior. Somewhere else, someone suffered quietly for the sake of order. The connection between the two was rarely acknowledged, yet it endured like a shadow beneath a banner. The truth about knights was never that they failed to live up to their ideals. It was that their ideals existed to make their failures survivable for themselves and for the world that depended on them to do what it would not admit it wanted done. And so the question was never whether knights were always noble and honest. The real question was why society kept asking them to be, while building a world that made such nobility almost impossible. That question, unlike the songs, had no ending. If there was an ending to the story, it did not arrive with revelation or reform. It arrived with repetition. Every age found its own version of the knight. Sometimes he wore armor, sometimes a uniform, sometimes a seal, a badge, a title that implied authority and distance from consequence. The names changed, but the structure endured. A figure empowered to act violently on behalf of an abstract good, surrounded by language designed to make that violence legible, necessary, regrettable, righteous. In the late years of the realm, when tournaments had become pageants and swords ceremonial, old castles were repurposed into administrative centers. Stone halls that had once echoed with war councils now echoed with clerks' footsteps and the scratching of quills. Decisions were no longer made with raised voices and clenched fists, but with votes, decrees, and legal precedent. This too was celebrated as progress. Yet in one such hall, a dispute arose over land on the southern border, an old disagreement, rooted in charters centuries apart. The council debated for weeks. Maps were spread, witnesses summoned. Finally, a ruling was issued. The land belonged to the crown. The inhabitants were ordered to relocate. When resistance followed, force was authorized. Not knights, not soldiers, officially. Enforcers, the document read. The language was precise. They arrived at dawn, organized and methodical. Homes were marked, livestock seized, families removed. There were no fires, no screaming battles, just a slow, grinding compliance enforced by presence and threat. A woman stood in the doorway of her house and asked why. One of the enforcers hesitated. He had children of his own. He had joined for steady pay, for stability. He believed in order. He recited the ruling as he had been trained to do. It sounded convincing enough. Years later, he would tell himself that he had only followed procedure, that the law, not he, had displaced those people, that his hands were clean, the logic was flawless and ancient. Far from the border, in a university library, a student studied a course on medieval chivalry. She read about honor codes, courtly love, vows of protection. The professor spoke of ideals, of how they shaped identity. A footnote mentioned abuses briefly. The student underlined it, then moved on. There was a test coming. Education, like myth, favored coherence. Still, cracks appeared. A novel was published that told the story of a knight not as hero, but as functionary, trapped, compromised, aware. The author insisted it was fiction. Readers recognized too much. The book was praised, then criticized, then quietly removed from some curricula for being cynical. Cynicism, after all, threatened morale. In private letters, veterans of modern wars wrote things that echoed Aldrich's unspoken thoughts. They wrote of confusion, of orders that made sense only on paper, of guilt that could not be neatly assigned. They struggled to reconcile personal decency with institutional demand. They were praised for service, thanked for sacrifice, rarely asked what they had been asked to sacrifice. The myth adapted again. Now the figure was not flawless, but wounded, haunted by what he had done. His suffering became proof of his goodness. The harm he caused was reframed as tragedy rather than responsibility. This version was especially powerful. It allowed empathy without accountability. It honored pain while leaving systems intact. Aldrich, had he lived to see such stories, might have recognized himself and felt uneasy, because pain did not absolve him. He had known, even when he could not act otherwise. He had understood the cost, even when he paid it forward. His suffering had been real, but it had not undone the burning of Sancerre, or the boy he killed in the first charge, or the winter that followed stolen grain. Suffering explained behavior. It did not erase consequence. That distinction was easy to lose when distance softened memory. In the end, the demystification of knighthood did not come from condemnation, but from accumulation, from too many stories that did not resolve cleanly, from too many lives that contradicted the song, from realizing that the question, were knights noble, was less useful than, what happens when we require nobility from roles built on violence? Aldrich's life had been one long answer to that question. He had tried to be decent within indecency, restrained within excess. He had failed often. He had succeeded occasionally. Neither had changed the structure that shaped him. That structure did not need monsters. It needed participants. And it found them easily, because the most enduring myth was not that knights were noble, but that nobility could survive unchanged inside systems designed to reward harm. Once that myth was questioned, truly questioned, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like a change in weather that only became obvious after the storm passed. People began to speak less of heroes and more of responsibilities, less of honor and more of limits, less of individual virtue and more of collective design. These conversations were uncomfortable. They lacked romance. They did not make good songs. But they mattered, because they suggested that the answer was not to find better knights, but to ask why knights were needed at all. That was the question Aldrich never had the language to ask, but lived every day of his life. And it was the question that lingered after the last song faded, not as an accusation, but as a warning. Violence does not become virtuous because it is necessary. Necessity does not become just because it is familiar, and no amount of polished armor, noble words, or beautiful stories can change what a sword is for. The knights of the Middle Ages were not betrayed by history. History was betrayed by the need to believe that those who held power could wield it cleanly. Aldrich knew otherwise, and now, slowly, unevenly, so did the world, and yet knowing, as Aldrich had learned, did not grant escape. Knowledge did not dismantle the machinery, it merely illuminated its gears. In the generations that followed, societies learned to speak more carefully about violence. Words like necessity, security, stability replaced honor and glory. The shift felt profound to those living through it, as if the age of swords had truly ended. But for those who looked closely, the resemblance was unmistakable. The knight had not vanished. He had been redistributed. Power no longer concentrated in a single armored figure. It fractured into offices, uniforms, protocols. Responsibility was divided so finely that no one could claim it whole. Where Aldrich had once carried his guilt alone, now it was shared so widely that it seemed to disappear. This was considered progress, but progress did not erase memory, it buried it. In one quiet town, built atop the ruins of an older settlement, construction workers uncovered a mass grave. Bones lay tangled, scorched, mixed with rusted fragments of metal buckles, spearheads, a bend spur. Scholars were summoned. They debated dates, causes, classifications. A report was written, likely victims of a localized conflict. The town council approved a memorial plaque. It read, "To those lost in turbulent times." No mention of who had ordered it, no mention of why. A schoolteacher brought her students to see the site. She spoke gently, emphasizing resilience, the tragedy of history. A child asked who had done it. "Men," the teacher replied, after a pause. "Men like everyone else." It was the most honest answer she could give without unsettling them too deeply. Elsewhere, in private, people continued to wrestle with the inheritance of the past. A novelist struggled to write a story about a knight who did not redeem himself, who neither fell heroically nor repented cleanly. Every draft felt unsatisfying. Readers wanted closure. Editors wanted transformation. But this is how it was, the novelist insisted. He lives, he compromises, he dies, and nothing is fixed. "Then it isn't a story," the editor replied. "It's a report." The manuscript remained unpublished. A museum curator debated whether to include a display on knightly atrocities. Donors objected. The exhibit would be divisive, they said. It would undermine heritage. A compromise was reached. A small panel, tucked near the end, acknowledging controversial actions. The sword was still displayed prominently, gleaming under soft light. Even those who tried to confront the past found themselves negotiating with its myths. Because myths, once embedded, are not lies people believe. They are frameworks people think through. And the framework of the noble knight had taught generations how to imagine power. Personal, moral, redeemable. It suggested that if only the right person held the sword, the harm would be justified. Aldrich's life argued otherwise. He had not been unusually cruel. He had not been especially virtuous. He had been competent, adaptable, alert to consequence. In another age, with different incentives, he might have been a merchant, a magistrate, a clerk enforcing policy. The shape of his violence would have changed. The logic would not. That was the uncomfortable continuity no song could carry. Late in life, long after Aldrich's bones had become indistinguishable from the earth, a collection of anonymous letters surfaced. They were written by men tasked with enforcing order in various times and places. Soldiers, guards, officials. None claimed heroism, none claimed innocence. One letter read, "I did what was required and hated myself for it. I did not do what was forbidden and congratulated myself." The line between the two was drawn by someone I never met. Another, "They thanked us afterward. That made it worse." Readers recognized something ancient in these words, though they struggled to name it. The letters did not accuse. They did not ask forgiveness. They simply described participation. That, more than any revelation, unsettled people, because participation implicated everyone. The myth of the night had always offered distance. They were violent, we were grateful. They bore the burden, we enjoyed the peace. But once that myth weakened, the distance collapsed. The question shifted from who were they to what do we ask others to do for us? That question had no easy answer. Aldrich, if he could have spoken across the centuries, might have said very little. He was not a philosopher. He did not believe in confessions meant to educate. He had learned that explanations rarely comforted the harmed. But perhaps he would have said this, that violence is rarely committed by those who relish it, that it is most often carried out by those who see no alternative, that systems built on force do not need villains, only obedience, and that calling such obedience honor does not make it cleaner. The knights of the Middle Ages had been asked to reconcile incompatible demands, to be ruthless and restrained, obedient and moral, feared and loved. They failed not because they were weak, but because the demand itself was a contradiction. Some resisted in small ways, some leaned into brutality. Most oscillated between the two, justifying each step as necessary. History judged them selectively. It praised their victories, excused their excesses, and forgot their doubts. But doubt was where the truth lived, in the hesitation before a strike. In the moment, a command felt wrong but lawful. In the quiet realization that survival required becoming someone else. That doubt never made good legends, yet it was the most honest inheritance of the age. So when people ask whether knights were always noble and honest, the answer remains unsatisfying, but true. They were as noble and honest as their world allowed, and as dishonest as it required. The myth endured because it absolved not only the knight, but everyone who benefited from his sword. To abandon the myth meant confronting complicity, and that was far harder than polishing armor and singing songs. Aldrich's story, scattered and incomplete, never demanded admiration. It demanded recognition, not of him, but of the pattern he belonged to. Because the age of knights did not end when armor rusted or castles fell. It ended only when societies stopped pretending that violence, when delegated, ceased to belong to them. And even then, the ending was not final. It never is. And because endings are rarely clean, the pattern did not conclude. It receded, changed its clothing, learned new manners. In the last chronicles that still bothered to mention knights at all, they appeared as footnotes, obsolete offices, ceremonial honors, echoes of a harsher age. The tone was faintly embarrassed, as if history itself wished to distance itself from the bluntness of steel. Yet the moral architecture knights had embodied remained intact. embedded in institutions that no longer needed armor to enforce obedience. The knight had once stood visibly between power and suffering. That visibility had been his burden and, paradoxically, his alibi. Everyone could see who carried the sword. When the sword dissolved into systems, the burden disappeared, but the suffering did not. This realization came slowly, often indirectly. In one small republic, founded on ideals of law and equality, unrest broke out after a series of economic decrees devastated rural regions. The government responded with emergency measures. Curfews were imposed, assemblies banned, enforcement delegated to agencies described as neutral and professional. When questioned about the consequences, an official responded, "No individual is responsible. The process functions as designed." The phrase was praised for its clarity. Those enforcing the measures told themselves the same thing. They were not knights. They did not act from honor or glory. They followed protocol. That made everything simpler and lonelier. One enforcer, standing guard during a nighttime eviction, watched an elderly man gather belongings in silence. The man did not beg. He did not resist. He only paused once, looking back at the door he had lived behind for 40 years. The enforcer felt a familiar tightening in his chest, an emotion he did not have language for. Guilt implied choice. This felt older, heavier. Participation. He remembered a story his grandmother once told him about a knight who came to her village long ago. She had said the knight looked tired. At the time, he had not understood why that detail mattered. Now he did. Tiredness was the mark of those who knew what they were doing but saw no way not to do it. That was Aldrich's inheritance, not cruelty, not heroism, but fatigue born of moral compression. The world rarely asked whether its protectors were good. It asked whether they were effective. Goodness was decorative. Effectiveness was rewarded. This was true in Aldrich's time, and it remained true in every iteration that followed. The tragedy of knighthood was not that it attracted violent men. It was that it trained ordinary ones to accept violence as structure. It offered them meaning in exchange for compliance, absolution in exchange for silence. Those who resisted outright were removed. Those who embraced brutality rose quickly. Those who lingered in between survived often longest, often unnoticed. History remembered the second group. Songs remembered the first. The third vanished into records, into margins, into unmarked graves. Aldrich belonged to that third group. He had not been exceptional enough to become legend, nor monstrous enough to be condemned. His life was composed of negotiations between orders and conscience, fear and ambition, mercy and survival. That was precisely why his story mattered. Because systems are not upheld by zealots alone, but by those who hesitate and comply anyway. Once this truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. It changes how one reads the past and how one inhabits the present. The noble knight, stripped of myth, becomes something far less comforting, a mirror. Not a mirror of individual virtue or vice, but of collective design, of what societies ask certain people to do, so others may feel secure, righteous, or distant from harm. The question then was never whether knights were noble. The question was, and remains, why nobility is so often demanded from those tasked with violence, while the structures that demand it remain unscrutinized. Aldrich's world had no answer to that question. It was not equipped to ask it. Ours may be no better. But there is value in recognizing the continuity, in admitting that the Middle Ages were not uniquely brutal, nor uniquely hypocritical. They were simply less skilled at hiding the mechanics of power. Armor made violence visible. Ceremony made it speakable. When those trappings fell away, the mechanics remained cleaner, quieter, harder to confront. The myth of the knight survived because it externalized responsibility. It suggested that morality resided in individuals, not systems, that if the right man held the sword, justice would follow. Aldrich's life disproved that gently, relentlessly. He had been neither right nor wrong enough to change the world. He had been shaped by it, used by it, discarded by it. And in that ordinariness lay the most damning revelation of all. That violence does not require villains. That injustice does not require hatred. That history is not driven forward by monsters, but by men doing what seems necessary. This is why the demythologizing of knighthood is unsettling. It does not replace heroes with villains. It replaces them with ourselves. And that recognition, once reached, offers no anthem, no banner, no easy resolution. Only a choice, quiet, ongoing, uncomfortable, to keep telling the old stories because they are beautiful and useful, or to sit with the fractured truth and ask harder questions about the worlds we build and the roles we create within them. The Middle Ages answered those questions with swords. Aldrich lived inside that answer and paid its cost. What we do with that knowledge is no longer his story, it is ours. And because it was now our story, it refused to stay in the past. The discomfort lingered in places where people least expected it, in ceremonies meant to celebrate order, in memorials meant to console, in language designed to reassure. The farther society moved from armored men on horseback, the more carefully it curated their image, as if afraid that without the knight, the logic he once carried might be exposed too plainly. There was a reason statues still showed knights upright, swords planted firmly in the earth, gazes lifted. No statue showed a knight counting confiscated grain, or waiting while prisoners screamed behind a door, or standing silently while a village burned because stopping it would have meant defying orders. Those moments were unsculptable. They resisted marble and bronze. They resisted closure. In a small regional archive, rarely visited, a clerk catalogued documents from the late medieval period. She worked methodically, aware that most of what she handled would never be read again. One afternoon, she opened a bundle of letters tied with brittle cord. They were reports from a minor lord's retinue logistics, payments, troop movements. One letter stood out. It was short, written in a rough hand, unsigned. We did what was commanded. The people fled before us. Some returned too soon. The order was carried out fully. I ask that my share be sent to my wife, for I cannot return. The clerk paused. There was no follow-up, no record of payment, no note of punishment or reward. The writer vanished into the administrative void. She stared at the page longer than necessary, then filed it away under its proper classification. There was no category for unease. That letter could have been written by one of Aldrich's men, or by Aldrich himself on a worse day, or by countless others whose names had dissolved into the sediment of history. It was not exceptional. That was what made it unsettling. The machinery had always depended on such letters, acknowledgements without confession, obedience without endorsement. As the centuries accumulated, scholars became better at naming structures, at tracing patterns of power and coercion. They developed terms for what knights had embodied without vocabulary: systemic violence, moral injury, delegated harm. These concepts clarified much, but clarity did not necessarily bring relief. To understand was not the same as to absolve. Some reacted by doubling down on myth. They argued that without idealized figures, society would lose its moral compass. Heroes were necessary, they insisted, not because they were accurate, but because they inspired restraint. This argument echoed an older one, made implicitly in Aldrich's time, that the myth prevented worse outcomes. And perhaps, sometimes, it did. A knight who believed himself honorable might hesitate where another would not. A soldier who believed in restraint might pull a blow. An official who believed in justice might bend a rule quietly. These moments mattered, but they were never enough to redeem the structure that required such internal resistance in the first place. That was the paradox at the heart of knighthood. Individual conscience functioned as both brake and lubricant. It reduced the worst excesses while allowing the system to continue unchanged. Aldrich's occasional mercy had saved lives. It had not saved Sancerre. The world learned slowly that relying on individual virtue to correct systemic harm was a fragile strategy. But learning did not mean abandoning it. It meant formalizing in training programs, ethical codes, oversight committees. The knight was reborn again, this time as the professional soldiers, professional enforcers, professional administrators, each trained to act without hatred, without passion, without pleasure, and yet still to act. In a training manual, centuries removed from chainmail and spurs, a passage read, "You are not responsible for the policy you enforce. You are responsible only for enforcing it correctly." The language was clean, reassuring. Aldrich would have understood it immediately. He had lived that sentence before it was written. One winter evening, a historian lecturing on medieval warfare was asked a familiar question. Were knights really as brutal as some sources suggest? She paused before answering. They were as brutal as the systems they served required them to be, she said, and sometimes less, and sometimes more. The audience nodded, satisfied. The answer was nuanced, balanced, safe. What went unsaid was the harder implication that brutality was not a deviation from knighthood, but one of its functions, and that this function had not vanished, only dispersed. The demythologizing of knights did not destroy romance. It relocated it. The longing for purity, for righteous violence, for moral clarity persisted. It attached itself to new figures, new uniforms, new narratives. Every era insisted it was different. Every era was partially right. Every era repeated the same mistake. Aldrich's age believed God sanctioned violence if the cause was just. Later ages believed law did. Later still believed necessity did. The justifications shifted. The outcomes remained recognizable. There were always villages that did not recover, always men who did what was asked and could not return, always songs that remembered courage and forgot cost. The real legacy of knighthood was not the sword or the oath. It was the lesson that violence could be made respectable if dressed carefully enough. That lesson proved remarkably durable, and yet, alongside it, another inheritance survived, quieter, less celebrated, harder to weaponize. It lived in hesitation, in refusal that cost promotion, in small disobediences that saved lives and ruined careers, in the awareness that legality and morality were not the same thing, even when authority insisted otherwise. That inheritance had no anthem, but it endured. Aldrich had carried it without naming it. So had Thomas. so had countless others who never became symbols. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were evidence. Evidence that the myth of the noble knight was not merely inaccurate, but incomplete. That it erased the most important struggle of all, not between good and evil, but between participation and resistance. That struggle did not end when armor rusted. It did not end when swords were sheathed. It did not end when stories changed. It continued wherever people were asked to do harm in the name of order and told that virtue would be assigned afterward. And so the story does not conclude with judgment. It concludes with recognition. The Middle Ages were not uniquely dark. They were simply honest in their brutality. The knights were not uniquely cruel. They were simply placed where cruelty was required. The myth of their nobility did not arise because they deserved it. It arose because without it, the world would have had to confront what it was asking them to do. Aldrich's life was one answer to that confrontation, an answer written in mud, blood, silence, and compromise, an answer without triumph. And perhaps that is why it matters, because as long as societies continue to polish the image of those who wield force on their behalf, the same questions will return, wearing new faces, demanding new myths. And the most dangerous myth will always be the same, that if the person holding the sword is good enough, the sword itself will become just. History, quietly and relentlessly, says otherwise. That quiet insistence of history did not announce itself with certainty. It whispered, it unsettled, it lingered long after arguments were finished and books closed. People wanted resolution. They wanted to know what to do with the knowledge once the myth cracked. But Aldrich's story, like the stories of so many others, offered no prescription. It offered only perspective, and perspective was an uncomfortable gift. In one city, long after knights had become costumed figures in parades, a debate erupted over a new monument. It was meant to honor defenders of the realm, abstract and unnamed. The design showed a lone figure, upright, resolute, a stylized echo of medieval statuary. No weapon was visible, only a stance of readiness. Supporters praised its symbolism. Critics asked whom it excluded. A committee was formed. Language was adjusted. A plaque was added, carefully worded. This monument honors those who bore difficult responsibilities in service of order. Someone suggested adding another line, acknowledging those who suffered as a result of that service. The suggestion was recorded, discussed, and ultimately rejected as diluting the message. The monument was unveiled to polite applause. Aldrich would have recognized the compromise. It was the same logic that had governed his life. Acknowledge difficulty, omit consequence, preserve legitimacy. Yet not everyone accepted this framing. In classrooms and quiet conversations, people began telling different stories. Not counter myths. Those were too symmetrical, too neat but fragmented ones. Stories without heroes, stories where outcomes were unclear, where intentions did not guarantee results. A teacher asked her students to imagine a knight returning from war and then asked a second question. What does he owe? The room fell silent. Owe to whom? His lord? His king? God? Himself? The villagers he passed through? The ones who would never see him again? The exercise had no correct answer. That was the point. Once, such questions would have been dismissed as impractical. Knights, after all, existed to act, not to reflect. Reflection was for priests and poets. Action was for men with swords. But reflection crept in anyway. carried forward by centuries of repetition. The demythologizing of knighthood did not make the past simpler, it made it heavier. Because once the knight was no longer a symbol of virtue, he became a reminder of choice under constraint and of how often constraint won. Aldrich had not lacked awareness, he had lacked leverage. That distinction mattered. He had known when he crossed a line. He had known when he obeyed out of fear rather than belief. He had known when mercy was possible but costly. Knowing had not saved him, but it had shaped him. The myth suggested that character alone determined outcomes. Aldrich's life contradicted that, gently but decisively. Character mattered, but so did context, incentive, punishment, reward. To ignore those was to misunderstand not only knights, but people. And so, the final unraveling of the myth did not happen in public declarations or sweeping revisions of history. It happened in the accumulation of small recognitions. In the moment, someone stopped saying they had no choice and instead asked, who made it that way? In the refusal to praise restraint without asking why brutality was permitted, in the realization that admiration could be a form of distance, the knight, once stripped of romance, became legible as a role designed to absorb violence so others did not have to acknowledge it. That was his function. And once that function was seen clearly, it became impossible to unsee it elsewhere. The language of honor faded, the language of duty replaced it, then efficiency, then necessity. Each generation believed it had become more honest. Each generation repeated the same bargain. Aldrich had lived inside that bargain without naming it. He had accepted land in exchange for obedience, protection in exchange for coercion, survival in exchange for complicity. He had not believed himself a hero. He had not believed himself a villain. He had believed himself trapped, and he had been right. The myth of the noble knight had never been about knights alone. It was about reassurance. Reassurance that power could be moral, that violence could be clean, that those who suffered did so for a reason that mattered. Once that reassurance faltered, something else had to take its place. What emerged was not clarity, but responsibility. Responsibility without romance, responsibility without absolution. It was less attractive. It did not inspire songs, but it had one virtue the myth lacked. It did not lie. And so the story, at last, arrives at its quiet center. Not an ending, but a reckoning. Knights were not always noble and honest. They were sometimes noble. They were sometimes honest. They were often neither, but they were almost always necessary to someone else's design. They carried out violence, not because they loved it, but because it was asked of them, and because refusing it carried costs few could afford. Their nobility, when it appeared, was personal. Their cruelty, when it occurred, was systemic. Their legacy was not glory, but precedent. Aldrich's life did not redeem the age. It did not condemn it either. It revealed a world that needed swords and then needed stories to live with them. Revealed how easily ideals could be used to decorate harm. Revealed how ordinary people could become instruments of extraordinary suffering without ever feeling monstrous. That revelation remains unfinished. Because as long as societies continue to build roles that require violence while demanding virtue from those who fill them, the question Aldrich lived with will persist. Not were they noble, but why do we keep needing them to be? And until that question is answered honestly, the songs will continue changing their melodies, changing their words, but always circling the same unease. The knight will ride on, not in armor, not with a sword, but wherever power asks someone else to bear its moral weight and promises honor in return. That promise honor in return for burden was the last refuge of the myth and its most enduring form. Even when armor vanished and banners were folded away, the promise remained intact. It slipped easily into new vocabularies, new uniforms, new ceremonies. Where once a knight knelt before a lord, now a man stood before a flag. Where once absolution was granted by a priest, now it came from procedure, from legality, from collective approval. The structure was familiar. Aldrich would have recognized it instantly. In his world, honor had been something spoken about endlessly and practiced rarely. It was invoked before violence and after it, but almost never during. During the act itself, there was only fear, momentum, and habit. Honor arrived later, like a bandage placed over a wound that had already scarred. That pattern did not change. A modern chronicler, writing about medieval knighthood, once concluded that the institution had failed because it could not live up to its own ideals. The sentence was widely quoted. It was also wrong. Knighthood had succeeded remarkably well at what it was designed to do. It organized violence, legitimized it, distributed it efficiently, and insulated those who benefited from its consequences. The ideals were not the standard. It was measured by stability, by control, by continuity of power. By that measure, the knight was not a failure. He was a success. Aldrich's life, viewed through this lens, ceased to be tragic in the romantic sense. It became illustrative. He had done exactly what was expected of him until he could no longer do it without breaking something inside himself. When he ceased to be useful, he was discarded, replaced, forgotten. This too was not an aberration. It was the system functioning. The tragedy lay not in Aldrich's fall, but in how easily his story could be replicated, how little had to change for another man to step into the same role, armed with the same justifications, facing the same choices. That reproducibility was the true danger. Heroes are rare, monsters are rare, roles are plentiful, and roles, once created, seek occupants. The Middle Ages created the knight because they needed someone to fight, to coerce, to punish, and to do so under the banner of legitimacy. The knight absorbed the violence so that society could imagine itself ordered rather than brutal. Later ages refined the process. They dispersed the function across institutions, diluted responsibility, professionalized obedience. But the core logic remained. Harm was acceptable if framed correctly and delegated to the right people. The myth of the noble knight softened the truth of that logic. It suggested that violence was not structural, but personal, that it depended on the character of the man holding the sword. Aldrich's life contradicted that suggestion again and again. He had been decent at times. He had been cruel at others. None of it altered the demands placed upon him. None of it changed what was rewarded or punished. His virtues had been tolerated when convenient and ignored when costly. That was the quiet lesson his life left behind. Not that virtue was meaningless, but that it was insufficient. This realization unsettled those who encountered it, because it shifted responsibility upward. It implied that the problem was not simply bad actors, but bad designs, not immoral individuals, but moral labor outsourced to roles that made integrity expensive. It was far easier to keep praising knights. So the stories continued. They became subtler, more psychologically complex. Knights now doubted, suffered, reflected. Their inner turmoil was highlighted as proof of depth. Audiences praised this realism, mistaking introspection for critique. But the structure remained untouched. The knight might regret his actions. He might question his orders. He might even suffer visibly. But he still carried them out. And the story still ended with his sacrifice framed as meaningful. That framing was powerful because it offered catharsis without accountability. Aldrich never received that catharsis. He died quietly, without vindication or condemnation. His life did not resolve into a lesson others could easily digest. It simply ended, leaving behind consequences that outlived him. Those consequences mattered more than his intentions. Villages burned did not care whether the knight had doubted. Children orphaned did not benefit from his regret. Land seized did not return because the order had felt wrong. This was the moral asymmetry at the heart of knighthood. The weight of action always fell downward, while the weight of meaning floated upward, reshaped into stories that comforted those least affected. To demystify the knight, then, was not to strip him of humanity. It was to return humanity to those his myth erased. To see not only the man in armor, but the villagers kneeling, the prisoners bound, the families displaced. To see the system that made such scenes routine, and then called them regrettable necessities. Once seen, this perspective could not be easily abandoned. It complicated admiration. It complicated nostalgia. It complicated the longing for simpler moral worlds. Because the Middle Ages were not simple. They were a world of overlapping authorities, fragile survival, constant threat. Violence was not an exception, it was infrastructure. Knights were not deviations from that reality, they were its agents. To ask whether they were noble was to misunderstand the question entirely. The better question was, what kind of world requires nobility from those it commands to harm others? Aldrich had lived in such a world. So do many, still. The myth of the noble knight persists not because it is true, but because it is useful. It allows societies to imagine that power can be exercised without moral residue, that harm can be purified through intention. History does not support this belief. It never has. Aldrich's life, stripped of ornament, stands as quiet evidence. Not an indictment, not a plea, but a record of what happens when ordinary men are placed at the sharp edge of authority and told that virtue will follow obedience. It rarely does. And so the story, at last, settles into its final, uneasy stillness. No triumph, no redemption, no villain defeated. Only the enduring recognition that myths are not created to describe reality, but to make it bearable. And that when we begin to see past them, what we find is not clarity, but responsibility. Responsibility for the roles we create, for the violence we delegate, for the stories we tell to live with the consequences. The knights of the Middle Ages carried swords. We carry something else. But the question they leave behind remains unchanged. When power demands harm, who will bear its weight and who will sing about it afterward? That question lingered because it had never truly been answered, only deferred, passed from age to age like a debt no one wished to acknowledge. In Aldrich's time, the answer had been simple, if brutal. The knight bore the weight, and the bard carried the song. The division was clear. One stained his hands, the other washed them with words. Together, they made violence survivable, not just for society, but for the men who enacted it. When the bard vanished, the song did not. It merely found new mouths. New institutions took over the work of singing. Courts praised restraint, states honored service, histories spoke of necessity. Each told a story in which harm was regrettable but unavoidable, and those who carried it out were dignified by the burden. The knight, in this sense, never died. He multiplied. Aldrich had been a single man with a sword and a horse. His successors were many, each holding a smaller piece of the same function. None felt fully responsible. All felt implicated. That fragmentation made resistance harder. In Aldrich's world, disobedience was visible. A knight who refused an order risked punishment, exile, death. But his refusal was unmistakable. In later worlds, refusal became procedural. It could be appealed, delayed, redirected. Responsibility could be deferred upward or sideways until it dissolved. The cost of this refinement was moral clarity. Aldrich had known when he crossed a line. He had felt it in his body, in the tightening of his chest, in the way sleep came harder afterward. He had known because the violence was close. His arm, his blade, another man's blood. Distance dulled that knowledge. As violence became mediated through orders, systems, technologies, the sensations faded, the consequences remained, but they arrived abstracted, delayed, statistical. Suffering became data. Guilt became optional. This too was progress. And yet, something curious happened as the figure of the knight receded further into legend. People began to miss him. Not the violence, but the visibility. The clarity of knowing who stood between authority and harm. The idea that power had a face, a body, a conscience that could, at least in theory, be appealed to. The myth of the noble knight grew stronger precisely as real knights disappeared. He became a symbol of moral immediacy in a world increasingly governed by impersonal force. This nostalgia was not for the past as it was, but for a past that felt comprehensible. Aldrich's world had been cruel, but it had been legible. You knew who burned your village. You knew whose banner flew overhead. You knew where blame lay, even if you could do nothing with that knowledge. Modern systems blurred that clarity. Who was responsible when harm followed policy? Who held the sword when it was wielded by committee? Who knelt? Who absolved? Who sang? These questions haunted the present because they had never been resolved in the past. Aldrich's life offered no comfort here. It offered only continuity. He had been visible. He had been named. And still, the harm he enacted had outlived him, while the meaning assigned to his actions shifted with each retelling. Visibility had not guaranteed justice. It had merely made myth easier. This realization unsettled those who had hoped that demystifying knighthood would free them from its logic. It did not. It only revealed that the logic was portable. The noble knight was never the source of the problem. He was its most elegant expression. Strip away the armor, and the role remains. Strip away the oath, and the function persists. Strip away the myth, and the discomfort grows. Because without the myth, there is no easy place to store moral responsibility. Aldrich's society stored it in honor. Ours stores it in procedure. Both achieve the same effect. Some resisted this inheritance more openly. A few historians refused to soften their language. They wrote plainly of raids, of starvation as strategy, of terror as governance. They were accused of being reductive, of ignoring complexity. But complexity, they replied, should not be confused with ambiguity. The facts were not unclear. Only their interpretation was inconvenient. Aldrich had not misunderstood his role. He had understood it too well. That was why he grew tired. Fatigue was the mark of those who carried the contradiction long enough to feel its weight. Zealots burned hot and fast. Cynics detached themselves. But those who still cared, who tried, however imperfectly, to reconcile action with conscience, were worn down. The system consumed them slowly. That was perhaps the most honest inheritance Aldrich left behind. Not a lesson, but a warning written in exhaustion. A warning that roles demanding violence and virtue at once will grind down those who attempt to satisfy both. A warning that moral injury is not a modern phenomenon, but an ancient one, simply unnamed for most of history. Aldrich had carried it without language. Others carried it now, with better terms and no greater relief. And so the story continues, not because it has something new to say, but because the conditions that produced it keep returning. Whenever a society asks someone else to do what it will not do itself, whenever it praises restraint without questioning permission, whenever it confuses professionalism with morality, whenever it honors sacrifice without examining what was sacrificed and by whom, the knight rides again. Not as a man in steel, but as a function. Not as a hero, but as a role waiting to be filled. Not as a relic of the Middle Ages, but as a recurring solution to an unresolved problem. Aldrich's life does not haunt us because it was extraordinary. It haunts us because it was ordinary. Because given the same constraints, the same rewards, the same fears, many would have lived as he did, compromising, enduring, obeying, regretting. That recognition does not invite condemnation. It invites responsibility. Responsibility not only for what is done in our name, but for the stories we tell to make sense of it afterward. The bards are quieter now, the songs more subtle, the armor invisible, but the question remains, as sharp as ever. If we no longer need knights, why do we keep recreating them? And until that question is answered, not rhetorically, not nostalgically, but structurally, the myth will endure, changing its shape, changing its voice, waiting patiently for the next Aldrich to step into its shadow and call it duty. The end, if it can be called that, is not an answer, but a stillness, a moment in which the noise of songs fades and only the shape of what remains is visible. Aldrich's life does not resolve into redemption or condemnation. It settles into something more unsettling, recognition. Recognition that the myth of the noble knight was never meant to describe reality, only to endure it. Recognition that honor was not a shield against cruelty, but a language used to make cruelty livable for those who commanded it, for those who carried it out, and for those who benefited from it at a distance. The knights of the Middle Ages were not a moral anomaly. They were an early visible solution to a recurring problem: how to organize violence without destroying the story a society tells about itself. Armor made that solution tangible. Oaths made it respectable. Songs made it survivable. When the armor rusted and the oaths lost force, the solution did not disappear. It refined itself. It learned discretion. It traded steel for systems, banners for paperwork, glory for necessity. But at its core, it remained unchanged. Someone must act. Someone must enforce. Someone must carry the harm. And someone else must explain why it was unavoidable. The myth of the noble knight endured because it placed that burden on an individual, then absolved everyone else by praising him for carrying it well. It suggested that if the man was good enough, the violence itself might become good, or at least forgivable. Aldrich's story quietly denies that comfort. He was not evil. He was not pure. He was not free. He acted within constraints shaped long before he was born, rewarded for obedience, punished for resistance, praised when his violence aligned with power, and forgotten when it did not. His moments of mercy mattered, but they did not undo the system that required brutality as a condition of order. That is the truth the myth cannot contain. Not that knights failed to be noble, but that nobility was never sufficient to redeem the role they were made to play. And so, the question that began this story, were knights always noble and honest, reveals itself as the wrong question entirely. The better question is harder and far less comfortable. Why do societies continue to demand nobility from those they task with violence instead of questioning the necessity of the task itself? As long as that question is avoided, the knight will return under new names, in new forms, wrapped in new justifications. As long as honor is used to decorate harm and duty to silence doubt, Aldrich's shadow will remain familiar. There will always be those who act, those who hesitate, those who suffer, and those who sing. The Middle Ages did not misunderstand knighthood. They perfected it. What followed merely learned how to hide it better. And if there is any lesson left to draw from Aldrich's life, from the villages burned and spared, from the choices made and deferred, it is not a call to judge the past more harshly, but to see the present more clearly. Because the most dangerous myth is not that knights were noble. It is that the world no longer needs them.